Hello, class, and welcome to Social Psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I will be your instructor. This week, we will be taking a look at attitudes and behaviors. This is really a key area in social psychology, as our attitudes really shape how we interact with the world. They influence our decisions and guide our social behaviors. So, in this lecture, we're going to explore how attitudes are formed and structured and related to our behaviors, because you really don't do anything unless you have an emotional will or need to do it, and that's how decisions are actually made. Now, as always, I like to start off with a little story, and then we will take a little bit of time and look at the foundational understanding of what attitudes are and how they're structured. And we'll explore something called the tripartite model of attitudes, which really kind of affects both the thinking side and the feeling side, as well as the choice or behavioral side. And we'll also look at different ways that attitudes are formed through our automatic processing of different types of learning, like observational learning, direct experience, classical conditioning, and operant conditioning. We'll then dive into the relationship between attitudes and behaviors and look at something called the theory of planned behavior, which is in Lapierre's study in the concept of cognitive dissonance. And then we'll close out with a little bit of the exploration of how attitude change occurs with social influence. And so we'll look at things like elaboration likelihood model, social conformity, the difference between implicit and explicit attitudes, prejudice and discrimination, those types of things. So I hope you enjoy this class. As always, I like to start off with a little story about someone important in social psychology. And today we have Dr. Leon Festinger, who is a key figure in social psychology. He was born in 1919 in New York City, and he passed away in 1989. And he's really known for his theory and development of what is called cognitive dissonance theory, which is a cornerstone of what we'll be exploring today, and really kind of looks at the relationship between attitudes and behaviors. Now, just a little bit about Dr. Festinger. He earned his PhD in 1942 and was studying under the influential psychologist known as Kurt Lewin, who we'll be looking at quite a bit in this course. And some things that he was really kind of known for was his investigation into the inconsistencies between people's attitudes and their behaviors. And that led him to teach at many different prestigious schools, including the University of Minnesota, the University of Michigan, and Stanford University. As I mentioned, his great theory is cognitive dissonance theory, which really kind of came to the fore in the late 1950s. And the whole idea of this theory is that it explains the discomfort that people feel when they hold contradictory beliefs, or when their attitudes don't align with their behaviors. So to reduce this discomfort, individuals often change either their behavior or their attitudes. And this theory has wide-reaching implications for understanding why sometimes people change their opinions or rationalize their actions after making some difficult decisions. And one of his classic experiments was the boring task experiment, in which participants were paid a large sum of money to lie about enjoying a tedious task. And they later reported actually enjoying the task more compared to those who were paid a larger sum. And this experiment, so the people that were paid a small amount of money enjoyed the task more than people that were paid a larger amount of money. And what this experiment really shows is the whole idea of cognitive dissonance. Showed that how people adjust their attitudes to align with their behavior. Now, there is some legacy with Dr. Festinger and his work that has really kind of gone on in the field of, anytime you're wanting to look at understanding the internal psychological conflicts within somebody, his ideas will come up, particularly in things like social change campaigns, areas like health psychology, and also even in marketing. So, very important figure for us to be mindful of. Now, as we begin here, our main goal is really to explore attitudes, which is really our evaluations of people and objects and ideas. And these kinds of things influence our behavior. And so we're going to look at how these two interact to shape our everyday social situation. So to just kind of get this going a little bit, I want to kind of just clarify the whole key concept here. Attitudes are, for example, you may feel positively toward a political candidate based on their policies, or negatively toward a food based upon a bad experience. And then your behaviors would be the actions that are influenced by these behaviors. Now, while attitudes can predict behavior, they don't do so perfectly. And so we'll explore, why is this the case? What other things are going on that affect this relationship? So when we look at the attitude structure, we can kind of think of it as three key components. We have the affective component, which is an attitude that refers to kind of our emotional reaction or our feelings, that gut feeling you have toward an object or a person or an idea. And these feelings can be positive or negative or ambivalent. So, for example, a person may feel fear when encountering a snake, reflecting a negative emotional response toward that object, or that snake in this case. Now, you may feel love also, or admiration toward a family member, or have a strong aversion to a certain food based upon past experiences. Those are the emotional component to this whole tripart model. Then there's the behavioral component, and that behavioral component of an attitude really kind of refers to how that attitude influences the way that we act or intend to act toward the object. So, for example, if you fear snakes, which is the affective component, then your behavior may involve actively avoiding places where you may encounter them. That would be the behavioral component. And then there's the cognitive component, and this refers to the beliefs or thoughts we have about the object of our attitude. And so we may believe, for example, that snakes are dangerous based upon information that they could potentially be venomous, which is going to influence our overall attitude toward them. And just understanding this tripartite model shows basically that attitudes are not one-dimensional, but rather they're made up of these three interacting parts. So, for example, your attitude toward exercise could include positive feelings, the affective side, a regular routine of working out, your behavioral side, and the knowledge of its health benefits, the cognitive side. So those are some ideas, but they don't align perfectly because all of these things play different roles in how we actually make decisions. And then, of course, there are different types of learning. There's classical conditioning, okay, where that whole process where you associate a neutral stimulus with a positive or negative experience, and this leads to the development of an attitude toward that stimulus. So over time, we form positive and negative attitudes based on repeated pairings of the neutral stimulus with an emotionally charged experience. Then there's operant conditioning, which is the attitudes that can be formed as a result of rewards or punishments. When certain behaviors are rewarded, people are more likely to form positive attitudes toward them. Conversely, when behaviors are punished, negative attitudes may develop. There's also observational learning or social learning theory. The idea that when we see someone else doing something, we adopt those attitudes by watching how other people respond to certain situations. And then there's our own direct experience, where our own personal experience can play a significant role in shaping our attitudes. When we have direct first-hand encounters with an object or a situation or a person, those experiences often inform our attitudes in a very lasting way. Now, let's look at the whole issue of the attitude-behavior consistency. We can kind of think of this as the theory of planned behavior. So according to this theory, behavior is not only influenced by attitudes, but also by subjective norms. That is basically what we believe others think we should do. And the perceived behavioral control, that is, how much control we believe we have over the behavior. And together, these two factors predict an individual's behavioral intentions, which in turn predict actual behavior. So there's a lot of things that are going on here. So, for example, a person may have a positive attitude toward recycling, but their behavior will also depend on whether they believe others expect them to recycle, which would be the subjective norm, and whether they have easy access to recycling facilities. That would be their perceived behavioral control. Then we have Lapierre's study which is really kind of a classical study about the inconsistency between attitudes and behaviors. So Lapierre traveled across the US with a Chinese couple at a time when anti-Chinese sentiment was very common. And although most hotels and restaurants served the couple without issue, when Lapierre later contacted these establishments, over 90% said they would refuse service to Chinese customers. And this study highlighted how people's stated attitudes do not always align with their behaviors. So people may express support for a charitable cause, but they might also fail to donate money or to volunteer their time. And this brings in something known as specificity, because one of the reasons attitudes don't always predict behavior is that the specificity of the attitude in relation to the behavior. So when attitudes are very general and just kind of not very concrete, they are less likely to predict specific behaviors. However, when attitudes are directly related to specific behavior in question, they are more predictive. Now, we'll dive in a little bit into cognitive dissonance, that whole concept that we talked about with Leon Festinger, that came out in the late 1950s. 1957, I believe, specifically is when it came out. Which really explains the psychological discomfort that people feel when their attitudes and behaviors are inconsistent. And so that causes people to change and adjust either their attitude or their behavior in order to reduce that discomfort. Now, with this dissonance reduction, the different ways that people reduce their cognitive dissonance is, first off, they may change their behavior to align with their attitudes. They may change their attitudes to match their behavior, or they may justify or rationalize the inconsistency between their attitudes and behaviors by adding new cognitions. So, for example, a person who engages in environmentally harmful behavior, like driving a big SUV, but they value environmental conservation, might reduce this dissonance by justifying that they recycle or donate to environmental causes, and thus they rationalize their behavior. So there's lots of different parts to cognitive dissonance. Then there's the whole issue of how attitudes can be changed through persuasion. And so with this, we'll explore the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion, which really explains the different ways that individuals process persuasive messages and how this impacts their attitude. So the elaboration likelihood model came out in the 1980s, and this model really kind of posits that there are two primary routes to persuasion. There's a central route and a peripheral route. And the route taken really depends on how much thought and attention a person devotes to the persuasive message. In the central route, this route involves careful, thoughtful consideration of the content and quality of the arguments presented. And it is most effective when the audience is highly involved and motivated and able to process the message critically. So when deciding on a political candidate, a voter who is highly motivated may carefully evaluate the candidate's policies and past performance before making a decision. But then there's also the peripheral route, and this route relies upon some superficial cues. And so this is something that actually most people are pretty lazy in how they think, and unfortunately, so this is how they are persuaded. So superficial cues are things like attractiveness or the perceived credibility of the speaker, rather than the quality of the arguments. And so it's more effective when the audience is less involved or less motivated to process the message in depth. So a person might be persuaded to buy a product simply because a celebrity endorsed it, without paying much attention to the actual benefits or the quality of the product itself. And there are several factors that really influence the effectiveness of persuasion. Things like source, so the credibility and attractiveness and likability of the communicator, the message itself, the content of the message, which really kind of includes how it's framed. Is it an emotional appeal or is it a logical reasoning? Messages that evoke strong emotions, particularly fear or hope, can be very persuasive, especially when the audience feels that the issue is personally relevant. And then, who is the audience? And the characteristic of the audience here really is important because it depends upon their prior attitudes, their intelligence level, their level of engagement, all of which plays a part and is going to dictate how much of this is a logical, data-driven argument, which is the central route, and how much it is based upon charisma and the attractiveness of the speaker, which are peripheral routes. So overall, persuasion often leads to long-lasting change when the central route is engaged. And the reason for this, it is because it's a deeper cognitive processing. But attitudes formed through the peripheral route tend to be somewhat temporary and vulnerable to change because they are based upon superficial factors. So understanding the roots of persuasion and the factors that influence attitudes can change in how people function and really kind of will dictate how we use persuasion in areas like marketing or political campaigns or public health initiatives. So the intention is really ideally to recognize first off whether the audience is more likely to engage in the central or the peripheral route, and then find the communicators that can tailor the message to maximize that impact. So let's look now at social influence and the whole idea of social influence, particularly things like being part of a group, and issues like conformity. Now, conformity is the act of changing your attitude or behavior to align with the norms of a group. You're trying to conform to the group. And so people often conform due to pressure to fit in or to be accepted by others. And so in Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiment, participants were asked to match line lengths. And despite the correct answer being really obvious, many conformed to the incorrect answers given by the group. And this demonstrates the power of social pressure in attitudes and decisions. And then there is normative versus informative influences. So a normative influence is kind of like when individuals conform to be liked or accepted by the group, even if they privately disagree. So people tend to adopt the attitudes of the group just to avoid being socially rejected. And then there's the informational influence. And this happens when individuals conform because they believe the group is providing accurate information or a correct judgment. So in this case, people adopt new attitudes because they trust the group's knowledge or the group's expertise. And those are two very different ways of being influenced by the social group. And then, of course, there's simple group dynamics, the whole idea of how group dynamics and group membership really kind of impacts your attitudes. First off, there's the whole idea of peer pressure and groupthink, which is basically the desire to belong to. And the thing is that this can lead to individuals changing their attitudes just to align with the group's norms and decisions. But that can have a real impact, particularly because what can end up happening is if you just identify with a group and go along with everything the group does, then because you're in that group and you're all agreeing, then ideas become much more radicalized. It becomes much more extreme attitudes. So when people with similar opinions engage in discussions, their attitudes tend to become more extreme in the direction of the group's prevailing view, which can be harmful. And that's why it's important to always try to have a broad scope of engagement in your life so that you are not influenced into an extreme one way or the other, but you are using the center route as much as possible and trying to use informative influences rather than normative influences, and not getting caught up in whole group dynamics and the desire for conformity. That's real wisdom there. Then there is the importance of making a distinction between implicit and explicit attitudes, and how both types can influence behavior, sometimes in very contradictory ways. And so understanding this distinction helps to explain the real complexity of human behavior, especially when people act in ways that seem inconsistent with their expressed beliefs. So we can think of explicit attitudes as our conscious beliefs or evaluations that we deliberately support and we reflect upon. Our explicit attitudes are formed through conscious processes such as personal experience or reflection, and they can certainly be influenced by social norms and education and deliberate reasoning, but they are our conscious parts. Then there's the implicit attitudes, which are our unconscious associations or automatic evaluations that can influence our behavior without any conscious awareness. And very oftentimes, this is formed through past experiences or repeated exposure to social norms that sometimes conflict with our personal explicit attitudes, and can really highlight how there can be a dual processing of attitudes going on within us. And so this whole dual process model in social psychology really kind of explains both the implicit and explicit attitudes, and that they both guide our behavior, that the implicit attitudes often operate very quickly and automatically, while explicit attitudes require more cognitive effort and deliberate reflection. And so if we are going to really make good choices, we need to slow down, take some time, and do some real thinking rather than making this quick gut decisions, because quick gut decisions are part of that implicit rather than explicit attitudes, which can lead to unconscious biases and discrimination. And that is something that, of course, in a just world, we want to avoid. And that brings us to the use of attitudes in context, because attitudes do play a huge role in decision making, and so we need to be aware of our own use of attitudes in order to support a just and fair society. And this brings in the ideas of stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination. So let's just start off with what a stereotype is. That's really a generalized belief about a group. And it's a really oversimplified and based on incomplete information, and this often leads to incorrect assumptions about individuals within that group. And so stereotypes can be either positive or negative, but even positive stereotypes can be harmful by reinforcing some rigid expectations. So there's the stereotype that women are more nurturing than men, and that can limit perceptions of their competency for leadership, even if the intention behind the stereotype is positive. Then we would have the idea of prejudice, and prejudice is a more negative attitude or feeling toward a group or people. And so unlike stereotypes, which are cognitive in nature, prejudice involves that emotional component and often leads to negative feelings or hostility towards a group of people. And then finally, there's discrimination. And discrimination is the behavioral manifestation of prejudice. So it occurs when individuals are treated unfairly or unequally based on their group membership, such as race and gender or sexual orientation. And while prejudice refers to attitudes, discrimination refers to actions that arise from those attitudes. So, for example, a hiring manager who holds implicit or explicit prejudiced attitudes towards women might be less likely to hire a qualified female candidate, even if he doesn't consciously realize his bias. And here is where the whole idea of the contact hypothesis is important, and we'll touch on this at a later time in the course as well. This is from Gordon Allport in the 1950s. But this idea really suggests that positive, meaningful contact between members of different groups can reduce prejudice. So when individuals from different groups interact in environments where they share equal status and common goals, their attitudes toward each other can be more favorable, reducing negative stereotypes and prejudices. And that, of course, is going to overcome a lot of the implicit bias and discrimination that goes on within society, which is what we want. Now, let's just take a little bit of time and just kind of explore a little bit of how these theories and concepts of attitudes and behaviors can be walked out into the real world. And really by understanding how attitudes can be changed or reinforced, we can see the impact of attitudes research on areas such as health behavior, environmental conservation, or marketing, or political engagement. So let's just look, for example, at a health campaign. Attitude change is often a real critical component of any public health campaign because it's aimed at modifying behaviors for things like smoking or exercise or diet. And these campaigns use persuasive messages to shift attitudes and encourage healthier behaviors. So, for example, an anti-smoking campaign often focuses on changing people's attitudes towards smoking by using fear appeals, that graphic image of the smoking effects on the body, and then providing information about the health risks. And this aligns with the central root of persuasion from that elaboration likelihood model. Then we can look at environmental behaviors. So attitudes towards environmental sustainability can significantly influence behaviors such as conserving water, reducing waste, recycling. And so efforts to promote environmental behavior often rely on creating positive attitudes towards sustainability through education, social norms, and personal responsibility. And so many campaigns use normative social influence by showcasing how many people already engage in environmentally friendly behaviors, encouraging others to follow suit. And this taps into both the normative and the informational influence, as individuals want to align with the majority and do what's considered correct. So those are just a few examples of how those can be walked out into the real world. And I want to just close now with a little bit of the idea of different key terms that we have covered. So what is cognitive dissonance? If you recall right from the very beginning of this lecture, that's that when you get that psychological discomfort that you experience when you hold two or more conflicting attitudes or beliefs or behaviors. And so people often seek to reduce this discomfort by either changing their attitudes or their behaviors to align with each other. Then there's implicit attitudes. What's an implicit attitude? Well, remember that is the emotional, the unconscious associations that influence behavioral automatically and without any deliberate thought. It's a very quick process. And these attitudes may contradict a person's explicit, consciously held beliefs. And then there's the elaboration likelihood model, which is that model to understand persuasion that explains that there's two routes to attitude change. There's the central route, which is the deep, cognitive, thoughtful processing of information, and then the peripheral route, which involves superficial cues, such as the attractiveness of the speaker. And unfortunately, the peripheral route is what most people tend to look at because they're not really engaged in whatever it is that's going on. And then finally, what statement would be true for the theory of planned behavior? Well, I would say that it really emphasizes the importance of subjective norms and perceived behavioral control in predicting behavior, and that would be an important part of that. So I want to thank you for your engagement throughout this lecture on attitudes and behaviors. We've explored how attitudes are formed and structured and change and how they influence our behaviors. So I want you to keep these concepts in mind as we go through this course and as you think about your own attitudes and how you make your own decisions and listen to and are influenced by the people around you. How do you allow them to influence you? And is it the best way? And I'll leave you with that. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. You take care. Bye-bye.